Welcome to another episode of Farming with Science.
Hi, I'm Julia Serkia, UF Extension Intern in Hillsborough County. Welcome to the third video in the series of educational videos we have created for the equine community. Today, Dr. Carissa Wickens is back to talk about equine management. Welcome back, Dr. Wickens.
Hello again, Julia. It's really good to be back.
Today, I'm going to ask you a few questions about equine management.
Okay, let's get started.
In looking at your equine property or facility, what are the most important aspects of a farm management system?
So one of the things that we tend to do is really focus on the horse, which is extremely important. It's why we enjoy being a part of the industry and having horses or keeping horses. But there's two really key aspects that I think we need to be careful and make sure that we're spending some time and attention on in our farm operation. The two that I think are most important are pasture and also what we're doing with our manure, how we're going to manage or at least temporarily store or deal with the massive manure that's produced from the horses that we're keeping. More and more, we are focusing on the potential environmental impacts of equine operations. We want to be good stewards of the land. We focus a lot on environmental stewardship, particularly here in the state of Florida, where a lot of our economic return in the state and attraction to the state is recreation associated with our water resources. So really making sure that we're mitigating loss of nutrients from our farm to our ground and surface waters is becoming really critical, making sure that we are protective of those water resources. In terms of pasture management, we have to start thinking about ourselves as educated, maybe not experts, but at least having some knowledge and experience with grass and weed science. So as much as it's about the science and care of the horse, we have to focus some of our attention and knowledge towards, are we going to actually be able to grow grass on our property? So thinking about the goals that you're setting, some people truly have enough acreage that they can establish and maintain good quality grass and have good vegetative cover in their pastures. Others really have limited space, and maybe the goal is just to provide turnout, small paddocks or areas where the horses can be turned out during the day or night and have exercise. Maybe they're not conducive to growing enough good quality forage to actually serve, a nutritional purpose. Maybe they can't provide nutrients to the horse, but they provide turnout and exercise. So thinking a little bit about goals in terms of pasture management is really important. And then in terms of manure management, again, the question becomes, we're going to have a lot of manure generated from these horses on our property. So we need to be very proactive in thinking about, how we're going to store that manure, where we're going to locate that manure storage location on site on the property in order to mitigate loss of nutrients to our water resources. And additionally, just, we have all this manure to deal with, can we dispose of it? Can we utilize it maybe to some extent on that property? So those are some really key things to think about. One of the other things that ties into all of this is good neighbor relations. So not only being good stewards of your land and the environment, but making sure that, especially in equine or equestrian communities where not everybody is a horse owner or has horses on their property, making sure that you're really keeping up those neighbor relations and being respectful of your neighbor who may not necessarily enjoy horses as much as we do.
Right. So recently, more attention has been given to how horse properties impact the environment. How can management practices affect the environment?
So when we are keeping horses on sites or properties, certainly they are excreting nutrients in their urine and their manure. Also, just generally on a pasture system, we might be applying fertilizer, herbicides, we're treating those pastures to keep the good grass and mitigate or control some of our weed problems. So we are adding nutrients to the system, both directly from the horse and also in terms of inputs to the farm system. So one of the things that we're really focused on is mitigating loss of nutrients to the environment from the things that we're doing or applying on farm. So in terms of the horse, again, this is excess nutrients that the horse isn't utilizing when we feed them. They're coming out, being excreted. They're landing on the grass in the pasture or in the stall, and then we're cleaning those stalls and removing those nutrients, removing that manure and that waste. So one of the things that we're really concerned about is, nutrients that are lost to ground and surface waters in particular, and we focus a lot on nitrogen and phosphorus. So we want to reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that's reaching our groundwater and surface water resources, because that can lead to nutrient overflow into those water systems that can create some significant environmental concerns and problems. So really what we're trying to do is just have good, or what we call best management practices on farms to help reduce those losses.
So what are some of the ways to best manage manure?
So when we think about nutrients that may be lost from manure, good storage and handling practices of manure on farm is really critical. There are some different options. Just to give everyone an idea of how much we're talking about, a light breed horse, a 1,000-pound horse, roughly every day will be excreting as much as 50 pounds of manure. So that's 50 pounds of manure per day. And if we calculate or extrapolate that out across multiple horses and across an entire, year or annual period, we're talking about, tons of manure that's produced and that we have to manage. So thinking very proactively, especially for folks that are maybe looking at a new property or have the ability to plan out their layout of their farm and their site ahead of time, that's always great. That's much easier to do than having to have an existing property and then make adjustments, but that can be done. But we want to think about where we're going to locate that manure pile or storage area on our property. We need to think about, with all of this manure that's produced, how much storage capacity does that area or location need to accommodate? But then we also have to start thinking about the ultimate end use or disposal of that material. So there are, again, different options. Some people will pay a monthly fee. There's a cost associated with removal of manure, but there are companies in many of our areas that supply roll-off dumpsters or very designated specific bins that you can, put your manure, put your waste material in and have that hauled away from your farm property. For some people, that is the easiest thing to do. If they lack the equipment or the time every day to pick up manure from paddocks or to clean out the stalls every day and try to handle that themselves, sometimes the roll-off dumpster idea is very helpful, very useful, but there is a fee associated with that. And that fee varies depending on your location, the amount of manure that you're hauling off. Some of these companies also, if you are housing horses in stalls, they have kind of a reciprocal arrangement where they can actually bring you shavings or bedding material, and then they bring this dumpster, the empty dumpster, back that you can put your waste material in, your manure and your spent stall waste. So again, that can be very beneficial for some people, especially if they're short on equipment or labor and time. One of the other aspects that we can think about is, do we have enough acreage and do we have a pasture management system that may benefit from application of the compost or manure? So even if we're not composting this material, and even if we're talking about some of this raw material, is there a use for that on farm? And there could be. We can use this not so much for a fertilizer application per se, because we don't have a lot of nitrogen in horse manure compared to some of the nitrogen content of other livestock species, but it does, again, contain some of these nutrients. It has phosphorus, it has nitrogen, it has potassium. And so those three nutrients are needed by pastures, and if we've got enough grass to actually uptake those nutrients, that can be very beneficial for the pasture system. The other thing that we have here in Florida are very sandy soils. So utilizing some of our stall waste, that can be incorporated as organic material into the soil, And so we can improve the water holding capacity of the soil. We can actually have some environmental benefits of incorporating some of this material into our pasture systems.
You mentioned composting as a possible management method. What are some of the possible benefits of composting?
So composting, again, this may not be a method that is conducive for everyone. Again, this will depend on your particular farm system, what works for you. And additionally, with composting, there are some inputs required to have really good, effective composting. Again, it'll depend a little bit on what type of equipment you have access to, the size of your property, the number of horses you have. And we've got some great resources that we can certainly direct folks to if you're really interested in composting as a manure management method for your farm. But let's just talk about some of the benefits. I mentioned that there could be some use on site, on property, for your stall waste or your manure. And that's true, but what some of the benefits that composting provides is it's really probably overall a better, safer, more effective medium to land apply, to put back on your pastures for several different reasons. If we're spreading raw stall waste out onto the pasture, it's not a very homogeneous or uniform mixture, and it can be somewhat heavy, it can be thick, and so if we start to amass too much of a layer of that material on our pasture grass, we can actually have some negative effects on the pasture grass. So we're not being that effective in kind of applying, what nutrients we have in that material. It can actually sometimes be a little bit of a detriment. But moreover, with composting in general, when we compost, we're basically speeding up a very natural decomposition process. We're using that organic matter in the urine and the bedding material and the manure, and letting the natural microorganisms, the bugs inside that pile, we're heating that pile, we're keeping that pile hot enough and at appropriate moisture, aerating, introducing oxygen to that compost pile. And so in that composting system or method of manure management, we're expediting that decomposition process such that overall, we can start with this huge pile of manure and stall waste, but we're over time reducing the volume. So we're reducing the amount of waste that we then have to either land apply or have hauled off or dispose of in some other means. So volume reduction is one of the really big benefits of composting. The other benefit is, as part of the composting process, when we're heating that material, we can have some beneficial impacts in terms of reducing parasite loads. We actually heat that pile effectively where we can kill off some of the parasites. We also can kill weed seeds. So again, we tend to think we can just spread or apply this material onto the pasture as is, but if we compost, we're going to mitigate spread of parasites and weed seeds back onto our pasture. One of the other benefits is also in terms of again, just coming back to that really good high quality soil amendment. So when we get this very humusy, fine, rich soil-like material, when we compost effectively, that is what we're then incorporating back into the soil or putting back out on our pastures. So especially with our sandy soils here in Florida, again, that just helps distribute nutrients and it helps hold some of that water capacity ability of the soil. So that's very beneficial for the pasture grass. A couple of things to keep in mind with composting in terms of the benefits of composting. Even with raw stall waste, we want to apply that material in a way that again is very mindful of mitigating negative environmental impacts. So making sure that we're not spreading or depositing this material in a sinkhole, for example, or right next to a body of water, a stream, or an open pond or lake. So being very diligent in where on the property that we're applying that appropriately, but also making sure that we're applying it when the grass can actually utilize it. So, our warm season grasses, so Bermuda or Bahia grass that is growing in most of our pastures, particularly Bahia grass is very common in our horse pastures here in Florida. That grass has its peak season, its peak growth rate is during the summer months. So, especially July and August, that grass is really able to utilize the nutrients that we're applying. If we were to spread that manure or that compost during the winter months when that grass is dormant, it really can't utilize the nutrients. And so again, when we have a heavy rain event, a lot of those nutrients may be washed off the property and again, infiltrate some of our water resources. So there is a right time and a right place for that application to get the most benefit from the compost, but also to mitigate those environmental impacts.
Now that we know the benefits of composting, are there any other aspects of pasture or manure management that horse owners need to know?
So one of the things that we kind of mentioned along the way with the previous question, we talked about, heating the piles and introducing oxygen into the piles, turning the piles. So there are definitely some how-tos involved in composting if that is a manure management method that folks want to try. As much as there's some science behind composting, certainly it is also a bit of an art. And so being able to troubleshoot and not necessarily expecting everything to go perfectly right the first time you tried to compost, that's certainly expected and it's fine. And again, we have some great resources that we can direct you to on how to get started. But very generally, there's really two options. If you're going to compost, again, you want to find an appropriate location for your manure storage area, or in this case, your compost system. Mostly what we're concerned about is making sure that we find a flat area of our property. We don't want this kind of set up on a hill. We certainly don't want it in a low-lying area that tends to collect water. So locating that, an appropriate distance from your private well, and again, not locating that in things like, low depressions or sites on your farm. So location, and then having a big enough pile assembled. If we want to effectively compost, we have to have enough material to get started with. So we tend to think of assembling a pile that is about a cubic yard. So roughly speaking, this is about a pile that would be the size of like a typical washing machine in your house or dryer. That's about as much material that we need to at least get that pile initially heating up and processing and decomposing. So location, having enough material put together, and then we have to monitor several things. Composting can be an active process. There's also some strategies that we can implement with composting that takes some of the time and labor away. We consider that more static composting, so I'll touch on that a little bit as well. But with active composting, we have to make sure that we are heating those piles. We want to keep those piles for almost 3 weeks at a temperature between 130 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit. That is what will help break down weed seeds and destroy some of the pathogens and parasites in the manure. So heating that and keeping that temperature maintained for a period of time is very important. We also have to introduce oxygen. This is an aerobic process. We need some air infiltrating those piles. So that can be done by manual aeration. We can get in there with shovel and pitchfork or with a front end loader on a small tractor and turn and stir up those piles periodically. If we see a temperature drop, sometimes that's a good time to take the outer edges and incorporate that into the middle of the pile. So again, turning and aerating will help that temperature control, but also introduce that oxygen into the pile. A way that we can do that more statically, if we don't have the equipment necessary to physically turn the piles, we can actually take PVC pipe and drill small holes along the length of that PVC pipe and put them, basically layer them horizontally into the compost pile. And some people will actually even get like a little automatic air pump. And so they can put that on a timer and inject air or pump air automatically into the pile so they don't have to physically turn it all the time. So that can be a great way to kind of have more of that static system that doesn't require so much labor and effort. Temperature and aeration, moisture is also very important. We do not want these piles too dry, but we also don't want these piles getting saturated with water or becoming too wet. So especially during heavy rain events, it's very important to have some means of covering the pile. Usually the easiest and cheapest thing to do is to have a tarp that you can just pull over those piles. You don't necessarily want the tarp tightly covering the pile. You want some air movement and some room for airflow above the pile. But pulling that tarp over during heavy rain events not only helps prevent the pile from becoming saturated, but again, the idea is that then you're going to mitigate nutrients being leached through the pile into the soil beneath your pile, or running off the pile, causing water runoff issues. So very important. You do want some moisture though. So one of the rules of thumb we use that's very easy, if you don't have a gadget or a moisture meter to stick into the pile, you can actually just grab a handful of that material, and when you squeeze it in your hand, it should not crumble apart. That means it's much too dry. But on the other hand, if you squeeze that material and you have water dripping through your hand, dripping through your fingers, it's much too saturated. So we kind of want, 50 to 60% moisture. We want kind of the happy middle of the road in terms of moisture content. We can easily add moisture by just adding water to the pile. Or if it's too wet and we need it to dry out, we can get in there and turn that material, aerate that material, and also add carbon material. So those are our browns, things like leaves, extra bedding, spent hay or straw, particularly if it's straw material or kind of a wood-based material. That's a carbon agent, and that's going to get in there and kind of help soak up some of that moisture. I think those are pretty much the key ingredients that we need. But one of the other considerations to make it easier is many people decide to actually build a small compost structure. It may have to be much larger if it's a bigger property, bigger facility with more horses to accommodate the amount of material that you have to handle. But a bin system can be great because it really makes that process more organized and a little bit easier to handle rather than just having this material kind of free floating on the surface of your farm. You can windrow, so we have like these little windrows of compost, but working in a bin system oftentimes makes it much more easy to manage. So those are some options too. One of the other considerations, very briefly, whether we're composting or especially if we're applying stall waste somewhere on site on the farm, we do need to consider if we're using herbicides on our pasture. There are certain herbicide products, particularly the herbicides that contain aminopyralids. Those products, even if we're composting that manure from that horse, there can be some residual herbicide still in that compost material. So when the horse grazes the grass that we've applied this herbicide on, we can have some feed through residual that comes out even in the finished compost. That's perfectly fine for land application. If we're putting it back on our pasture, we may even get some added benefit of some of that residual herbicide, in terms of weed control in the pasture. But if we're going to give this compost away or market or sell this compost to a grower or nursery, we do need to be forthright in telling that end user that there may be some herbicide residual, because depending on the use of that product, particularly if we're talking about putting that in garden systems, if that herbicide residual gets on your tomato plants, for example, it can wilt the tomatoes and maybe even kill your tomatoes. So just as an example, we do have to be kind of vigilant of what we're putting on our pastures. The fact that some of that may be going into the manure, and even if we compost, there might be some residual left over. Our state agencies, Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services, our Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and many of the personnel that are involved in our water management district agencies. So we have 5 primary water management districts throughout the state. We have all worked very hard together to develop some great resources for horse owners and equine facilities on how to implement these best management practices. So we have a lot of great information, particularly on pasture management and manure management, and how to develop a system or to implement these practices on farm. So there's actually 2 existing best management practices manuals for horse operations. One is meant to be more of a, directed more towards large scale operations. And we also have a manual that's a BMP manual for small acreage or small scale equine operations in Florida. Those are available on the Florida Department of Ag and Florida Department of Environmental Protection websites. Our county agents and specialists throughout the state are also engaging in quite a few learning opportunities as it relates to best management practices for equine operations. So certainly keep an eye out with your local county extension office for upcoming programs and events that focus on farm management. We do a lot of great educational delivery in terms of demonstrations and even some hands-on visits to farms when we can, to show how horse owners and different facilities are managing their manure and their pastures on farm. So we've got a lot of great resources that we can certainly help direct you to.
That's all the time we have for this segment. If you have any questions, you may reach out to Dr. Wickens at cwickens@ufl.edu. And don't forget to check out our other equine educational videos. See you next time.